Good morning, everyone, and welcome to those of you who are present and also to those who are present online. Today we will present some of the contents of this year's issue of Nordic Economic Policy Review, which deals with EU climate policy, as you can see on the screen here. And my name is Harry Flam. I'm a co-editor of this issue together with my colleague, Professor John Hassler. But first, I want to give the word to the Minister for Financial Markets, Niklas Wyman, please.
He took the issue so I wouldn't start reading it instead of giving the speech here. So dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Nordic friends, so happy to be here with you this morning on this beautiful day in Stockholm as well. So those of you who are guests, I hope you feel most welcome and have some time over to enjoy our city as well. Beliefs, feeling, intuition, values are of course crucial for all of us. When I woke up this morning, I didn't have to make a logical process for going out with my dog. I just knew that it was about time to go out with him, based on experience and based on my knowledge of dogs. And I guess many of you have the same problem every morning. And beliefs, feelings, intuition, and values are also, of course, important not only to do what to do, but also to do it in an efficient way. I mean, so many decisions to make every day, and if we need to do them with our calculus power in our minds, we would be stopped already before breakfast every morning. So there's nothing wrong about feelings or intuitions or values. They are, of course, necessary, but not sufficient tools to manage in everyday life and in policy and in policy making. So those are of great importance. But I had a teacher in mathematical statistics who always said that intuition is the worst thing you can have. It's the most dangerous enemy when you deal with statistics and math. And I guess many of you know the very famous example. And he told it, I think, almost every lessons actually when he had his 10 minutes argue on intuition. Do you know how many people there must be in a room for a 50-50 chance for a common birthday? And then he started, and since the evidence takes some minutes to go through, we after a few lessons knew it quite well, of course, that you need to be not 365 divided by 2, but you need to only be 23 people in the room to have a 50-50 chance of a birthday in one day. And this is so important to stress in a situation like this, because a discussion without facts, and those days many people would argue that we have quite many discussions with only feelings, value, ideology and so on, but without the facts. And sometimes facts are really difficult to find or to agree upon, of course. And that's why research and conferences like this is of crucial importance for policy makings, because intuitions and feelings and beliefs are very important in human life and in policy making, but without facts, we always risk to make really bad decisions for the people that we are supposed to serve. But even having the facts is many times not enough, because policy making and politics is often it's sometimes about a bad choice and a good choice, but quite often I find it's about two bad choices or two good choices. It's rarely when it comes to the level of politics, it's not necessary to choose between bad and good. That's often already done. We have to choose between bad or good. And then, of course, efficiency is also crucial. And it's really difficult to have feelings or intuition for efficiency, especially when it comes to complicated areas such as climate policy. So once again, it's of utmost importance that everyone in the academic society, within policy making, and civil servant have tools for making both correct and efficient decision. The Nordic Economic Policy Review is one of the most prominent publication in our part of the world in this field, and it's of course an honor to say welcome to you all. And it's important to stress that it's also a platform like this for academia, policymakers, politicians to come together and to have discussions, debate on those issues, and to listen to insights from others. So I'm really happy to be here and to take part of this issue, this report, and also to welcome many more in the future. For us as policymakers, it's so extremely important to have access, dialogue, and to have reports to read on topics that are debated and discussed today. And this is, of course, a very timely report in a very important issue. This focus of this year's economic policy review is, as I said, both relevant and timely. We are having the presidency in the European Union, as you know, and this is one of our main priorities for a greener future. And energy and green transition has been on the international political agenda at least since the end of the 80s. Some people are quite surprised that it was Margaret Thatcher who really started to address this issue at the end of the 80s on an international level. And she had a speak that could be held today, maybe without even changing as much as a word, when she talked about this as a question for the planet, for mankind, and so on, with words that we today perhaps normally would associate with other politicians. Sweden, the Nordic and the European Union is sometimes together front runners, and sometimes we in the Nordic countries are quite alone as front runners. And this Fit for 55 is of course an important landmark, both for us to continue our struggle to be the best, but also for other European countries to catch up, and hopefully and eventually the rest of the world as well. And I think this discussion we have here about leadership versus common rules is of course in the core of the question of what to do. So I'm really much looking forward to read and to understand more, and to join you also in the future for much of debate and discussion. And once again, this hard work, it's really much hard work to make such an issue. It's very appreciated. It's very important for us as policymakers, and also come together like this, having discussion, having debates, scrutinizing each other's arguments is of great importance, not only for the happiness of the mind, but also for the state of the world. So thank you so much for taking your time. And once again, welcome to Stockholm.
Before going on to one of the papers in this issue, I was going to give you a quick refresher on EU climate policy. For those who perhaps are not so familiar with EU climate policy, first I want to say that the EU now requires member states to achieve a 55% reduction of CO2 emissions by 2030 and to be climate neutral by 2050. The EU emission trading system is one part of the EU's climate policies that try to achieve these two goals. And as you know, every year a fixed amount of emission permits are auctioned off or given out for free. And this system covers about 50,000 industrial installations, air transport within the EU, and this is equal to about 50% of total emissions. Now, as part of the negotiations now presented on the proposal by the Commission, ETS will be extended to shipping and air transport outside the EU by EU airlines. And the free allocation of permits will gradually decrease, and the total amount of permits will be reduced, and no new permits will be allocated after 2040. And a new emission trading system starting in 2026 will cover heating and cooling of buildings and road transportation. The second part is the effort sharing regulation. This part covers small industrial installations, agriculture and waste management. And until 2026, it also covers heating and cooling of buildings, which will then transfer to the new emission trading system, and maritime and road transportation. There will be an EU-wide ceiling. There is an EU-wide ceiling and national targets, and that's why it's called an effort sharing for these sectors. And national emissions allocations can be traded between EU countries and Norway and Iceland. The third part of EU climate policy is what's called LULUCF, one of the many acronyms in EU terminology, which stands for land use change, and forestry. Agriculture and forestry is a net absorber as a whole for the EU of greenhouse gas emission. And emissions from agriculture consist mainly of methane and nitric oxide, which is then translated into CO2 equivalents. Member states will be assigned national targets for this sector depending on their land mass and forestry. And I should also mention that this sector is a net absorber in Finland and Sweden, although less so than we previously thought, apparently, according to very recent findings. And Denmark is a net emitter. And finally, we have a new instrument which will take effect in a few years, which we call the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. This is to deter what we call carbon leakage, which is an effect of higher costs of emissions in the EU causes relocation of production from the EU to non-EU countries. And it might increase imports of carbon-intensive products. Exporters to the EU will now have to buy permission permits at the same price as ETS permits for the corresponding product category. And this applies to, at least first, to heavy emitters of carbon dioxide, which is iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizers, cement, hydrogen, electricity, and some up and downstream activities. And free ETS permits will be phased out as CBAM is phased in. So now you know everything there is to know about EU climate policy, and we can go on to the first paper that we are going to present today, which is authored by David von Belo, Björn Carlén, Svante Mandel, and Vincent Otto, and it's Svante and Björn who are going to be presenting the paper here today.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you all for having us. Nice to be here. And as Harry said, this is joint work with David, Björn, Vincent, and me. Vincent is here, Björn is here. And we're all at Konjunkturinstitutet, or the National Institute of Economic Research. The idea here is that Sweden has long been acting as a forerunner, been striving to act as a forerunner in climate policy. And as we heard, we got Fit for 55. EU is strengthening their climate policy, so the EU is now sort of catching up with the Swedish targets. So this seems to be a good time to discuss sort of costs associated with the Swedish national climate policy relative to a policy where we more align the Swedish policy to the EU's. And what drives this is that we could then exploit a series of flexibilities in the EU climate policy that we sort of cannot do if we keep the current Swedish target design. And to estimate these costs, we use a general equilibrium model, a CGE model, that covers Swedish economy, is to try to get an idea of these costs. Well, Harry told us a bit about this. We've had since April 2021, we got EU's new climate law, stating that EU should be climate neutral by 2050, and also introducing an intermediate target for 2030, stating that the emissions should, by 2030, be 55% less than in 1990, hence the Fit for 55. The Fit for 55 proposal came after that, and it was a proposal from the Commission basically stating how to reach that climate law, the climate neutrality by 2050 and the 55% less by 1990. It says currently under negotiation. Most of that negotiation is finished by now. So, and as a whole, I would say that the actual policy to come is by and large what was proposed in Fit for 55. You're not supposed to read this, but I think it's a good picture illustrating the size of the Fit for 55 package. There are a lot of proposals in that. So mainly all of the EU's former policies are revised, strengthened, and there are also a few new things like the CBAM, the new ETS for road transport and heating and small industries. So a large package. And I guess we've seen this, but the three parts of EU's climate policy relies on the EU ETS, energy-intensive industries, aviation, electricity production, the LULUCF, it is about uptakes, and the ESR, which is the focus of what I will be talking about, which covers agriculture, transportation, heating, and basically all emissions not covered by the ETS. The ETS will see a huge decrease in the number of permits to be allocated in the future, meaning that sets the emissions from that sector so they will be much lower than they were before. We also introduce maritime will be included in the ETS and a couple of other things. The LULUCF, which will be a large issue for Sweden, which I will not talk much about today, is that we now introduce binding net targets for the member states. So Sweden will need to increase their uptake due to this in mostly forests. And then the ESR, which again will be focused on what I will be talking about, we'll get lower quotas for the member states. The total sort of reductions needed to do by every member state is increased by this, except for Malta. For Sweden, this means that formally we should meet -40 by 2030 compared to 2005, and now we should reduce our emissions by 50%. So quite a substantial increase. And also we got these new ETS, which Harry was talking about, and those emissions will still be in the ESR, which makes the construction a bit complicated. We'll see how that will work in the future. Okay, so that was very, very brief about the EU, and then Sweden has its own national targets. So by 2045, as opposed to the EU's 2050, Sweden has decided that the emissions from that, well, the Swedish emissions, both from the ESR and the ETS sector, must be 85% less than they were in 1990, and the remaining 15% may then be compensated by something called supplementary measures that could be increased uptake in land and forests, for instance. There are two intermediate targets, one for 2040, stating that the emissions by then should be 75% less than the 1990 levels. We got a small part of that maybe achieved by supplementary mechanisms or measures. What's up on the agenda at the moment is the 2030 targets, which is just a few years in the future, where the national target states that ESR emissions must be 63% lower than they were in the 1990. Of this, 8% may be achieved by supplementary measures, and it seems that we're going to use that option. So we're heading for minus 52, right? There is this special target also for the transport sector. Land-based aviation is in the ETS, so it's not covered by this. And that's transport sector target states that emissions from that sector must be 70% lower than 2010, and there are no supplementary measures to reach that. That would be important. We'll come back to that. This is an illustration of the Swedish emissions in the ESR sector. We leave the ETS sector that's handled by emissions trading. But this is the Swedish ESR sector from 2010 to, I think, 2019 is the last, or 2020. We see that emissions are decreasing. Good. These are divided by gas. So the upper two parts, the dark blue and the light blue, are CO2. The darker ones are CO2 from transportation, covered by that transport sector target I was talking about. And the remaining are non-CO2 gases, mainly from the agricultural sector. There are a few things to note here. First, again, emissions are decreasing. We are moving in sort of the right direction. The upper darker blue, again, there are transportation. If we are to reach the transport goal of minus 70 by 2030, the dark blue ones must be the lower dark blue one at 2030. That is the transport sector target. And one interesting thing is that if we manage to reach that, actually all other emissions could stay at the 2019 level. We don't have to do anything outside the transportation sector. Interesting observation. Also note that outside the transportation sector, more than half of the emissions are actually non-CO2 emissions. We have got basically no policy in place, or at least no economic policy in place to handle those at the moment, which makes it very difficult to in a short time at least, decrease them. Okay. At the moment, the EU demands minus 40 of us, and that will be increased to minus 50 compared to 2005 levels. So, and the Swedish targets are compared to 1990 levels, so we need to do some recalculations. And if we do that, we see that the Swedish target, if we use full supplementary measures, corresponds to minus 52. Minus 52% is basically the same as minus 50. There's no big difference between what EU demands of us after Fit for 55 compared to our own national targets. And also, if we include that we need to increase our uptake in the LULUCF, basically that EU has catched up with the Swedish national targets. And given that we've been a forerunner, so we had larger, so we said that we want to do more in Sweden than what EU requires of Sweden. And now we're in a situation where EU the EU requirements are basically the same as the Swedish national targets. This may be a good time to have a discussion about what to do, because it doesn't really seem that we're that forerunner anymore, right? So perhaps we could revise the targets. And again, what we are interested in here is that the Swedish targets are designed in a way so we cannot really use the flexibility that the EU policy provides for us. And just an example, textbook economics. Let's say that we look at our transport sector target again, and say that QT on the left there is how much we must reduce emissions in the transportation sector, and the corresponding amount we have to do outside the transportation sector is as much less. I would use a pointer perhaps. Skip it. The idea would be that the last emission reduction we do in the transportation sector will cost you much more than the last emission reduction you do outside the transportation sector. So if we switch a little bit, we move that last emission from the last emission reduction from the transportation sector to outside the transportation sector, we could save a large cost. That last unit in the transportation sector was very costly, and increasing the reduction sort of outside, it doesn't cost that much. So the idea would be that we could move emission reductions in the economy in a way that total emissions are exactly the same as before, but total costs are much lower. And when we have a transportation target saying that we should do minus 70% in this sector, we can't do that. There's no flexibility. Basically, it's a similar story in the EU, saying that it could be that the last reduction we need to do in Sweden will cost us more than the last reduction they need to do in, say, Romania. And the EU policy framework provides a possibility to trade within these, meaning that we could actually buy a reduction unit from Romania, so they will make a profit, and we don't have to do that very costly emission reduction in Sweden. And this is actually a good thing, because climate wouldn't mind. The emissions are exactly the same as before, but we could avoid the most costly reductions somewhere, perhaps in Sweden, and replace them by less costly ones in other nations. The Swedish target states that the emission reductions should be made in Sweden, so they sort of prohibit this trade. So, to give you some idea about the costs involved in the Swedish policy, we used our CG model and set up a couple of scenarios. We had a reference scenario using current policies. We do not reach the target in that scenario. We were aiming for minus 63 here. And then we have 4 different setups. A1 is where we simply increase the CO2 tax until we reach the target. A2 is that we reduce the biofuel standards, which happened yesterday. And then, with the lower biofuel standards, we increase the tax until we reach the target. B is switch to the old system, where we only had a CO2 tax on the fossil emissions. Take away few of these subsidies, so we aim for one price for all CO2 emissions, one uniform price for all CO2 emissions in Sweden. And the last one is, okay, let's allow for trade between member states, so we're aiming for one CO2 price in all member states. What will happen? This first one says something about what tax is needed to reach those targets. The first thing I should say that in the C option, where we can trade with other member states, we simply assume. We have no clue at the moment on what the price of such trade would be. How much must we pay for an emission reduction from another country? There's no such market at the moment. There's no price observations to be made. So we simply make an assumption saying 2,000 Swedish crowns per ton, basically twice the current price in the ETS. Out of the blue, remember that. If 2,000 tons Swedish crowns per ton would be correct, then our model says that, well, we will reduce the Swedish emissions by 36%, and the remaining 27% to reach 63, which is the target we're aiming for, that will be made abroad, and we will sort of buy that from, I don't know, Romania. And all other scenarios, we reach minus 63 in Sweden, the Swedish target without supplementary emissions. I just want to note one thing, that the A2, that is where we reduce the biofuel standard and then increase the CO2 tax until we reach the target. That will require an enormously high CO2 tax. The reason being that the biofuel standards sort of locks the blend in petrol and diesel. There are no incentives from the CO2 tax to increase the amount of biofuel in diesel. So you're stuck with, I think there was 6% we agreed on yesterday, right? And then we have to reach the target, we need to increase the tax so much that people drive so little so that emissions drop to minus 63. And that, if we want to do it by increasing the CO2 tax, requires an enormously high CO2 tax. Probably not what we will see, because that will result in higher pump prices, which is opposite what we're after. Not going through all this, we can see in the top GDP as expected. When we go from A1 and A2, does not have a uniform CO2 price in Sweden. When we go to B, then all sectors within the ESR pay basically the same price for emissions, then GDP goes up. And if we also allow for trade with other nations, again assuming a price of 2,000 Swedish crowns per ton, then the GDP increase even more. This is what we would expect, because we're moving towards a more and more efficient climate policy. Basically, we see the same pattern for household consumption and similar patterns for basically all other sectors. This is, I thought this was fun. This is some transport fuel prices. The percentage changes compared to the reference scenario. So if you're quick in your head, you can calculate this. But what I'm after here is that, again, the A2 reduced the reduktionsplikt, the biofuel standards, and then try to, with that fuel containing a large amount of fossil, still trying to reach a target, the prices for fuels must be extremely high so that you don't buy it, basically. You have to be persuaded not to use your car, so it has to be very, very costly to use it, which is sort of counterintuitive to what we would expect. So I think that's interesting. And then basically we see the same pattern in B, the same CO2 price for all emitters in the CO2 emitters in the ESR, yields very much lower pump prices than in A2. And if we again allow for trade with other countries under our assumptions, then actually we will decrease pump prices compared to 1990. Again, remember there's an assumption lying behind that. So to conclude this, again, Sweden has sort of motivated its own climate policy with being a forerunner, being an example for other countries to follow. And in many senses, we have been that. But now EU, through the Fit for 55 package, is basically catching up. And at the same time, there are substantially large gains, potentially large gains, from sort of implementing a more uniform carbon pricing in Sweden, which, to be clear, means that the transport sector target is a problem here, because that requires the very costly reductions to be made there. And also to use the fact that we are allowed to trade with other countries, so we can have a more uniform carbon price over the entire EU. And I mean, these things could reduce costs without hurting the climate. The emissions will be the same, but the cost will be lower. But to use that, we need to look at the Swedish national climate targets, how they are designed. And that's it.
Okay, let me start by telling a little bit about Norway. Norway is a very different country compared with most European countries and most countries in the world, in particular in two areas. First, Norway has a very large offshore petroleum sector, standing for, in 2021, 21% of GDP. Actually, even much higher than that last year because of the extremely high natural gas prices. And this sector accounts for a large part of GDP, but also the mainland Norwegian economy is also very closely linked, because there's lots of industries supplying both investment goods and intermediate inputs into this sector. The second feature of Norway is that we already have, unlike most countries, we have 99% renewable energy. Electric energy is 99% renewables. Mostly 91% hydro and the rest wind. So clearly these two features are important also for CO2 emissions from Norway and compared with other countries. Almost 25% of the total CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions comes from the petroleum sector. This is the natural gas used on the platforms to get the energy to pump up the oil and gas. So that's one feature. And if you go down the table, you see that transportation, both road traffic and other transportation, is an important contributor to the total greenhouse gas emissions. And also you see that there's virtually no emissions from electricity production, unlike most countries. And finally, and that's I think quite similar to at least Sweden, agriculture, emissions from agriculture are large. Almost 10% of the total. In our article, we don't talk about those emissions because they're non-CO2, and that's totally different types of policies required for those emissions and others, so we simply ignore those, but it is important for the overall emissions. So our article is divided into three parts. First, a very brief overview of the relevant economic theory. Second, we look at policies and goals in the short term towards 2030. And then thirdly, we discuss somewhat what sort of structural changes in the Norwegian economy might we expect towards 2050 and beyond, given that this is going to be a more or less carbon neutral society. So starting with theory, it's I think all economists would agree that a price on carbon emissions should be at least a very important policy instrument. And if you look at a Economics 101 textbook, they'll say that a tax of this type, a price on emissions, which is a special case of a tax on some negative environmental externality. That's the only policy. If you have that at an appropriate level, you're fine. The rest you can leave to the market. In reality, it is of course not quite so simple. There could be there's many bad reasons for supplementary policies, but there are some good reasons as well. One is the distributional considerations. Usually when one talks about distributional considerations, one thinks about high income versus low income. That, in my opinion, is not so relevant, because if you increase a carbon tax, you get government revenue, and the total distributional effects depends completely on how this is recycled back. If you could recycle all of it back to low-income households, then clearly the distributional effect is very different from giving it in a more general tax cut, same percent to everyone. Having said that, I think no matter how the revenues from the carbon tax is used, it's still the case that people perceive the tax as a direct cost. The reimbursement that they have lower taxes than they otherwise would have had is much more invisible. So it's easy you get a political opposition against high and in particular rapidly rising government taxes. But there is one distributional consideration that you're not going to get around no matter what, because no matter how you redistribute the tax revenue, there's always going to be some households are heterogeneous. Some have, either due to preferences or historical investments, they have much higher carbon emissions than others. For instance, if you live in a large house or have a long commuting distance are two examples. And clearly there's going to be oppositions from those groups. For them, if an alternative to the tax would be some sort of subsidy to an alternative to carbon energy. That is also costly, but the costs are distributed in a different way. Now, partly because whatever a high tax, and especially a rapidly rising tax, is going to be met by some stuff, it's going to be controversial. Partly because of that, or independent of that in one way, governments cannot really commit to a future carbon prices. And given if present taxes are controversial, investors are not going to know really what the carbon price is going to be in 10 or 20, 30 years' time. And for many major changes, if you're rapidly going to reduce carbon emissions, this requires large and long-term investments. And if the prices of carbon emissions are uncertain, then the profitability of these investments are also uncertain. So this might require additional instruments. And finally, there's other externalities and market failures. In the paper, we just discussed a couple. Technology development is one. Second one is coordination issues, especially when establishing new markets. There could be a coordination issue. One example is nobody's going to purchase an electric car if there's no charging stations, and nobody's going to build a charging station if they don't expect people to buy electric cars. So that's just one obvious example of a coordination issue, which might require some kind of government policy. So there are reasons for additional instruments. However, it's not the case that the more instruments one use, the better. Each additional instrument, in addition to some pricing of carbon emissions, should be justified with a good reason. Okay, so let me now go through Norwegian climate goals and ambitions. And the most important is obviously the Paris Agreement, which Norway is part of. Like Sweden, however, Norway's commitment to the Paris Agreement goes via the EU. Although Norway is not a member of the EU, for all these climate issues, Norway is, for all practical purposes, a member. So Norway's commitment to the Paris Agreement is just like Sweden's. It's a deal that Norway has with the EU. So that's the second one, agreement with the EU, and that's a threefold agreement. First, we participate in the EU ETS, and second, we have a specific commitment for non-ETS emissions, and presently, that commitment is reducing our emissions by 40% towards 2030, and I never can remember the base year, but whatever, it's 40%, and it's a linear reduction. We have an agreement year by year that we have to have. If we don't, that we can't violate. However, also these emissions are part of the effort sharing regulation, so Norway has some flexibility also there. And finally, we have an agreement with the EU on a specific commitment on LULUCF, land use change and forestry. Again, I'm not going to talk about that. That requires totally different policies than the CO2 emissions, or the CO2 emissions from transportation industry, etc. Norway also has a climate change act, which is mostly a long run towards 2050. We should have at least 90% reduction of CO2 emissions compared with 1990. But also in this act explicitly says that this can be seen in cooperation with other EU countries. So it's not necessarily fixing emissions from the Norwegian territory. And then the two last, the so-called Hurdalsplattform. Hurdal is a place in Norway. That's the present government. There's a commitment to reduce total emissions by 55% by 2030 compared with 1990. So it's a commitment on total emissions, ETS plus non-ETS. So that's very different from the agreement we have with the EU. And I'll return to that a little bit later. And then the various municipalities, sectors, etc., have specific goals. One example is that all new cars should be emission-free by 2025. That's a goal we have in Norway. That's much earlier than I think we have a similar ambition in the EU, but I think Norwegian ambition is about 10 years earlier as far as I can remember. And the second one, and this is very important, that is a particular goal for the offshore petroleum industry to reduce its emissions by 50% from 2005 to 2030. And I'll return to discussing that afterwards. Okay, what about policies in Norway? Well, first in the ETS, there's a quota price, which is currently approximately €100. In addition, for two of the sectors within the ETS, there are specific carbon taxes in addition to the quota price. And that's the petroleum sector and the domestic aviation. Both of these have additional taxes. For the non-ETS, the current price CO2 tax in Norway is 952 kroner. And that was about €90 some months ago when we wrote this, but the exchange rate for the Norwegian kroner has sort of gone down the hill after that. So all these numbers have to be recalculated somewhat. And this is planned, and that Parliament has agreed to that in real terms, this should approximately double by 2030. So this is a sort of semi-commitment, but it's not a commitment that if I was going to invest in something which really depended on this doubling happened, I would obviously be uncertain, will this happen or will there be a policy change? Specific policy for electric cars. They've been heavily subsidized both directly and indirectly. We discussed some of that in more detail in the article. And this policy has been very successful in the sense of the share of electric cars. 79% of all new private cars were electric in 2022. I think that's more than any other country in the world. But we don't have a goal really on the number of electric cars. If you think of how much CO2 emissions is from it, you have to ask, are these more people buying car number 2 and using them instead of taking the bus? These electric cars have special rules for being able to drive in the bus lanes, things like that. So it's not so easy to know exactly how much CO2 emissions have gone down due to this. But certainly they have gone down. We don't know how much. They've gone down. CO2 emissions in Norway have certainly gone down due to the large share of electric cars. They would have been higher otherwise. I think that's reasonably safe to say. However, if you look at the emissions within the whole of Europe, it's not so obvious, because Europe has mandatory emission reduction targets for all new private cars, so many grams of CO2 per kilometer. Now, if this emission target is binding, then subsidizing electric cars and getting more electric cars simply means it's easier to achieve this binding target, and it won't necessarily change the average CO2 from all cars. So, seeing in light of the EU rules, it's not so obvious that Norwegian policies directed to climate cars are reducing emissions in the total EU plus Norway. And in particular, if transport sector is included in EU's new quota system and Norway participates in that, like we do it with EU ETS, then it's really going to be difficult to justify the present Norwegian policy of subsidizing electric cars. And it should be said that Norway is gradually phasing out the subsidies and benefits to electric cars. So in that respect, we're going in the right direction. It might have been smart to do that previously, but it's about time to sort of relax these policies. Offshore petroleum, Norway has a CO2 tax of about, the quota price plus the specific tax is about 170 euro per ton of CO2. In spite of this, most platforms, it's more profitable to burn gas and produce energy in that way instead of having electricity cables from mainland and electrifying these. However, this is a policy in Norway that we want to electrify several of the platforms. It's not obvious what the effect of this is, however. Certainly it is going to reduce emissions from Norwegian territory because this gas, which otherwise is burnt on the platform, is no longer burnt. We use electricity. On the one hand, though, this gas isn't going to just disappear. That means there's going to be more gas to be exported since they're not burnt on the platform. That's going to be burnt somewhere in Europe. That's one effect of it. Second, electricity production or electricity in Norway is closely linked to electricity in the rest of Europe. So increased electricity use in Norway means more, given the current electricity mix in Europe, this is going to be more emissions from that. So it's not really obvious from what the net effect of this is going to be on European CO2 emissions. And then adding into this that both the electricity sector and the offshore petroleum sector is part of the EU ETS, it's not obvious at all if this is going to really be a policy that reduces European-wide emissions. Having said that, this specific target for the offshore petroleum sector with electrification, if this is actually necessary, given, or more or less necessary, given this goal of the total emissions from Norway should be reduced by so much. That was I called from the Hurdals platform. So given that goal that you're sort of focusing on total emissions and not distinguishing between ETS and non-ETS, then it's difficult to see how Norway can achieve that without this mandatory electrification. So our summary of the policies towards 2030 is that we should really carefully consider having goals and policies directed towards the EU ETS, which one has to have if you have these total emission cap. And in addition to the effect or lack of effect on total EU emissions, the whole idea, if Norway and other countries starts having policies directed towards sectors in the EU ETS, we're undermining the whole idea behind the ETS. The whole idea behind the ETS is to have a common cap. It's the total emissions from the EU which are important for the climate. So we have a total cap, and then we leave to the market to find the most efficient, cost-efficient way to achieve that cap. If you start meddling around and doing sector-specific policies directed to ETS sectors, you're undermining the whole idea of the ETS. Okay, so that is just what I said. This electrification, it might be profitable in the long run with higher quota prices and less CO2 or less CO2 emissions in the energy mix from Europe. But forcing this rapidly towards 2030 seems to be a very wrong policy. Okay, so how much time have I used? Okay, so turning now to the second part of the paper, it takes up at least half of the the written article, but I'm not going to use as much time here. This is the sort of transition to a low carbon society, sort of looking at towards 2050 and beyond. Obviously, when you have a rapid transition from a carbon or quite a carbon intensive society into a low carbon society, you're going to have a lot of structural changes in the economy. So what role should the state have in this? And there are basically two views. One is what we in our article call the neoclassical state. And that is that the role of the state is to correct well-defined market failures without sector-specific policies. And then the market determines which sectors which will grow and which will decline. And the second view is more a sort of proactive state, which is based on a less confidence in markets and various policies to support specific industries and sectors that the state expects to be profitable in the long run. And that's often what economists criticize, calling picking winners. And the present government leans at least more to the second of these than the previous government. How much it is in words and how much in reality remains partly to be seen, but already you see some sector-specific support systems. So the present government has sort of identified some sectors that I think are going to be important in the future. And let me just list them up and then very briefly discuss them. These are the sectors discussed in our article. Petroleum extraction, I'm not going to say anything more about that. CCS, carbon capture and storage, production of hydrogen, offshore wind power, and batteries. And for all of these, an obvious question to ask is, does Norway have a comparative advantage? And second, probably if there's a no to that, that should be no more question, but if there's a yes, is there a justification for government support? So if we start by looking at CCS, carbon capture and storage, Norway probably does have an advantage, partly due to we have the storage, the geological structures for storage facilities, and there's a large offshore competence in Norway, which probably can be used in CCS. And in fact, here Norway has already, the government has committed to making a storage facility outside of the west coast. And one justification for such a government support is, of course, the coordination problem again, because nobody's going to start capturing carbon if there's nowhere to place this carbon, and nobody's going to build a carbon storage site if they don't believe there's going to be a market for this. So this active government policy in this case, I think, can be justified in a startup phase. Hydrogen can be produced in many ways. For the relevant in a low carbon society is two ways, so-called what one calls blue hydrogen, which is produced from natural gas in combination with CCS, so you capture the carbon, so it's a carbon-free hydrogen. And the second is so-called green hydrogen, which is made from electrolysis using electric energy to make hydrogen from water. So again, does Norway have a competitive advantage? Well, probably due to our availability of natural gas, since for reasonable assumptions about natural gas prices and electricity prices, it seems that so-called blue hydrogen is much less costly than green hydrogen. So Norway has a comparative advantage, but it's not clear at all what is the future market for hydrogen looks like. Some argue that it's going to be a very important market. Others say that this is not going to ever going to be an important energy carrier. So it's certainly uncertain. So there is not obvious justification for the government to support this, but of course blue hydrogen is closely linked to the whole issue of CCS, which I did argue that Norway could play a role. Does Norway have a competitive advantage in offshore wind power? Not obvious, but high competence in offshore activities tends to perhaps give Norway a comparative advantage. But even so, it's not so easy to find a good reason for government support. Electricity is a well-defined market. It's unlike hydrogen and CCS, where these are new markets. This is a market for electricity, which is a well-established market, and it's not clear that we need any kind of government intervention. And finally, batteries, which the Norwegian government thinks is a good green industry, and it might very well be true that battery production or the demand for batteries in Europe and the world is going to increase significantly over the next decades. But does Norway have a comparative advantage? I'm not so sure. I don't really see what that should be, and it's difficult to find a good justification as far as I can see. So to sum up, scaling up of new green industries in Norway should be based on sound economic principles. And I guess I've already, that's just a repetition. Some of these sectors, such as the government has pointed out as sort of promising future sectors, do probably have comparative advantage, but for battery production, I'm not so sure.
So the starting point for that Harry and I had when we sent out the call for papers to this region, to this conference, was that there is a pretty clear support for the Nordic countries being forerunners in climate policy. But we also see that lots of things is now happening in the European Union, and that really should be taken into account when we think about how we can become and continue to be forerunners in the climate policy. Are we forerunners? Should we be forerunners? In what way should we be forerunners? Is the only way to be forerunner to have a tighter national emission target, or is it something else that we can do? So that's the kind of issues that I would like to discuss, or rather hear our panelists discuss today. So we are very glad to have three very prominent people to discuss these issues. And the first is Jytte Guteland. Please come up. Jytte, I suppose everyone knows, she is now a member of the Swedish Parliament. She used to be a member of the European Parliament and was there instrumental for actually the things that we are now talking about, the climate law in particular, but also the reforms of the EU ETS. So it's going to be very interesting to hear what you have to say. We have Per Kågesson. Per Kågesson, for Swedes, don't need any introduction, and it's actually would be very difficult to give an introduction and presentation of you. You've been with me for all my conscious life, so I guess I read the first book of you 50 years ago or something like that, and since then it's been continuing. And you're still very active in the Swedish policy discussion. And lastly, Svante Mandel, who you already heard. Svante is head of, as you heard, I don't know exactly what it's called, but the division at the Konjunkturinstitutet, the National Institute of Economic Research, that deals with climate and environmental issues. You used to be a researcher at VTI and also Stockholm University, I think, where I am. So I'm going to let the panel start with a few minutes, 5 minutes each. Jytte.
Thank you so much for having me here. I was a member of the European Parliament during 8 years, and I had the privilege to work with the climate legislation. So I worked with the climate law as the rapporteur, and I also worked with Fit for 55, some of the main legislative proposals there, mainly ETS reform. And I did that also for two times. I had the privilege of being the shadow rapporteur, so I was responsible for my political group for the ETS 2 times. Both the first mandate from the 5 years after the election to 2014, and then also after the Ursula von der Leyen Commission. And I would like to say that I think it was like night and day to work with climate proposals, my first mandate and my second one. The first time we were always the late birds in the debate. We were coming out at the latest, often in the evening and in the night, and I had a baby during that period, so I often actually had him with me in the debate. So you can see it literally by looking at some of the streamed debates from the European Parliament, you can see that I often was accompanied by my little son. And that was because environmental and climate proposals were not that hot. So when all the other people had left the building, the other politicians, journalists, everyone except we in Envy, we were still there working with climate proposals. Not all of Europe were thinking that we were not that hot. We were lobbied. We had lots of industry actors following our work. But actually in the debate, we were not the big stars. So I often found that a bit frustrating to be working with so important legislation and not having attention around it. And I think for the climate proposals, it was also not giving the results that we would have wished for. But I am proud from that first mandate that we did do some tool improvement of the ETS. It was really a much more lame directive before that reform. I don't know if you remember, but people talked about it, that the industry could buy a million ton CO2 equivalent for €5. And in the end of that mandate, it was actually €80. So it was a big improvement actually, but still not enough. And then I would like to come to and conclude my very short introduction by the second term from 2019. Then suddenly climate and the climate legislation was the hot thing. So everyone wanted to be in Envy, so we had to fight, and I was lucky because I had already been there. So I got the privilege of being my group's coordinator, so I was the group leader for my group, and I also got the privilege to actually be rapporteur for the climate law. And we had much easier to be progressive during the second term, because the election 2019 was a big shift. And the big shift, I think many of you know it, but that was definitely the Paris Agreement and the IPCC reports that had been presented during the first period I mentioned, but also Greta Thunberg and Friday for Future movement and the attention among in all our member states. So during the second term, the Ursula von der Leyen Commission had to do more. And she and her commission presented the Green Deal, the climate law, and also the Fit for 55. And we were working with it, and now we were the first one to take the discussions out in the plenary. So now we were first out, everyone was listening, it was completely different. And the things we tried to do with the LRF, for example, in the ETS, in the first period, I had to kind of drag every percentage out of the other institutions. In the second, it was like, okay, we give you the double. Would you like some more? Yeah, we give it to you. So it was quite a game change, I would like to say. But now I would like the other gentleman to take the floor, and I will
follow up with a question. Actually,
yeah,
before.
thank you.
So now you're back in the Swedish politics.
Yes.
So how can you explain, or can you understand why it seems so difficult for the policy discussion in Sweden, and I think also in the other Nordic countries, to take in what's happening at the European level, and maybe also accept that, you know, the policies that are decided there affect climate policy at home?
Yeah, for me it feels like I'm back in 2014 again. So for me it's like the circle has gone the whole way back. So for me it's quite a shock actually this year. Coming back, hearing people talking like the Fit for 55 doesn't exist, or as if it's going to be presented now. It's already decided, almost all of it, and now it has to do with the implementation, how to do the work. That's where the discussion should be. What tools should we use to do what's said in Fit for 55? That should be the focus. Instead, it's like people are waking up and saying, "Oh, something is talked about in Brussels. Maybe we should engage ourselves." And I find that frustrating, because we were some people trying to get the attention, and I think we got some attention too, but obviously something was missing, because I feel in the public debate, it's like one is speaking about the Swedish climate law and not about Fit for 55. And if we talk about it, it's like it is there is a kind of choice here, like maybe we could choose something else. Sorry, that train has already passed. Now it's about how to do it. And we could, and hopefully we will, talk about the democratic aspects of this, having the debate about proposals too late. That's not a good idea if you would like to engage people. Thank you.
So are we forerunners is one of the questions posed to us by the organizers. And I think it's fair to say that the Scandinavian countries has, in some respect, been forerunners, in the sense that we have helped commercialization of new technologies, sometimes together with others. Norway played an essential role with battery electric vehicles, but together with parts of China, California, and others, that created the volumes needed in order to cut costs. And I think it's also fair to say that Denmark played a similar role with the commercialization of wind power back 20 years ago. And Sweden maybe could claim that we, by replacing electric radiators, provided a new market for very efficient heat pumps 25 years ago. We may recall also the much criticized German Energiewende and its feed-in tariffs, which played an essential role for providing volumes for the market of solar cells to the benefit of the entire world, and particularly to China, which exported these things to Germany and the rest of Europe. But we can also see that the ambitious national goals that has been decided, for instance, in Sweden and Norway, are far from being achieved. There is a very noticeable gap between goals and tools. We can see the idea in Sweden of cutting domestic transport emissions by 70% until 2030 was based on the assumption that traffic volumes could easily be reduced rather than continuing to rise, and on a very ambitious biofuel obligation, which is currently based to 85% on imported bioenergy. I don't think we can claim to be a true forerunner based on that experience. The Fit for 55 package has reduced the gap between national ambitions in the most ambitious countries and the EU. And I have difficulties seeing that if we were to reach the long-term goal 5 years ahead of the EU, that would provide incentives that would contribute substantially to the advancement of new technologies that could be widely used across Europe and the world, compared to moving at the same speed as the rest of Europe. So I think that time lies behind us. But it's also interesting to note that in two respects, we need to become or to stay forerunners, because we have agreed to do more than others in two respects. One is the LULUCF regulation, forestry and land use, which Svante Mandels and others' contribution highlighted, but they didn't go into the details of how the incentive is going to be provided to landowners and to forest industry. That is something that Sweden needs to, and other countries needs to start working on. And of course, that what we need to do is related to the the feasibility of increasing the carbon sink. Sweden has 65% forest land, so of course we need to do more than some others. The other area is the SCR regulation, which you touched upon in several of the, or both introductions, where Sweden, to my surprise, has agreed to cut its emissions by 50% in 2030 compared to 2005, despite the fact that in 2005, heating made up only 8% of those emissions, which is much, much less than all the other countries. And transport made up around 50%. It still is 50% of the remaining emissions from the Swedish ECR sector. And that means, of course, that we will have to face a higher marginal abatement cost compared to most other countries. And then it's interesting to see whether it would be feasible to trade with others. But we don't really know whether there will be a market for those quotas, or whether bilateral agreements with other countries will be the only way of doing it. And we don't even know how many other countries with lower targets will be overachieving them. So this is a tricky matter to understand. And that makes me think that we will have to at least temporarily use subsidies to some degree. We will have to do what John highlighted in his comment. When you read this thick volume, it ends with some comments by John, saying that it's essential to streamline permission processes for green infrastructure, and I might add for manufacturing. And we might have to go further than countries that has to do less in the transport sector compared to what we must achieve, particularly when it comes to charging infrastructure. And of course, he also highlights the need for the necessary competences and manpower to become available, and I think that is a real challenge. I think we will have good use of the more stringent carbon emission standards for new vehicles, but we also need to be better than the average country in terms of buying them. And that leads me to the idea that for some years we have to provide some kind of incentive, particularly on heavy duty trucks, where the cost gap is still considerable compared to diesel engines. Svante and his colleagues proposed the development of a market for carbon dioxide, which would make it less necessary to use all these other supplementary instruments. And I agree in principle. I actually, close to 20 years ago, was mandated by the Swedish government to provide an assessment of the feasibility of expanding the carbon trade to the transport sector, which I felt was a good idea already then, but it hasn't happened. And the problem with your academic approach is that if you try to make politics out of it, it's going to take at least 3, 4, 5 years, including assessments, public hearings, proposal, a bill by the government, and some time for citizens and industry to adjust to new rules. So I think that we need to rely on second-best solutions at least up to, say, 2028 or something like that, which means that a large part of the ECR period will have to rely on instruments that we already have. We need to make them better, which I think can be done by relatively fast decisions by Parliament. But to replace them by something much better would take something like 5 years and might be important in the longer run, but not for 2030. And we also need to remember that the ECR commitment applies to every single year from now and to 2030 and beyond. So we cannot wait for years in order to replace current national legislations by better ones. I think I stop there.
I follow up with a question to you too. So you were quite critical against the transport sector target in Sweden, and for you who are, every Swede knows about the transport sector target, I guess, but for those of you who are not Swedish, it says that we have to reduce emissions within the Swedish transportation sector by 70% to 2030. And you were critical about that when it was set. How has your, and you remain critical, as I understand, how has your kind of view on it, has it changed, or is it the same argument as before?
That the position that I took 10 years ago when this was first investigated was that it was not possible without extremely high taxes on road fuels to depress demand for road transport to the extent that that committee thought possible. By government seemed to agree with what the committee said and relied on reducing traffic to an extent which I felt was completely unrealistic. I was also rather critical on the high quantities of biofuel to be used in the Swedish transport sector, because that is nothing that other countries could do, because we would all become net importers of bioenergy, and it seems to me rather strange that a country with 65% of its land covered by forests should rely on a large percentage of net import. So I think I've stayed with the analysis that I made 10 years ago. It seems relevant to me today. I haven't really changed my mind.
Vad var det jag sa som svenskar säger?
Yeah.
Svante? Or did you want to, you can come in now if you want.
Thank you. I just wanted to say on the ETS proposal for the transport sector that I do think it's going to happen, but I also agree that it's not a quick fix, but it's not going to be the Swedish only to have a market for that. It's going to be for the whole European Union, and actually both the council and the parliament has said yes to it, but it's not. It's going to be lots of things that needs to happen before, like there is going to be, they have to analyze how the energy prices are. It's going to be later in this decade, so it's going to be closer to 2030. But still, even the European Parliament said yes. So that's, once again, we have proposals on the EU level that is taking place, but the member states speak as if they are creating something on their own. But this is going to happen, I'm quite sure of it, since we have the decisions. But then when and how many obstacles around it and how strong it's going to be, that is something that I think can still change. But that there is in the current ETS amendments about having an ETS for the transport sector, that has been agreed. But how it will look, how the price signal will be, how strong it will be, everything around that is still up to kind of discussion.
I would like to put a question to you on that particular matter, because the ETS BRT, as it is called, which is supposed to be up running in 2027 or 2028, it provides an option for member states to opt out, not to participate, provided that the country in question has a carbon tax which matches the price level of on the ETS too.
Yeah.
But then, could Sweden argue that we have this? Because what we did in road transport was just relabeling part of the existing diesel and petrol tax, calling part of it energy tax and the other part carbon tax. In my view, in order to be able to use the opt-out option, the Swedish fuel tax on diesel and gasoline need to, the part that we call energy tax should match the price on photos on the new ETS. Otherwise, we would be cheating.
Yes, as I understand it.
That is not really, it's not part of the regulation. I cannot see how the EU has intends to tackle this.
Me neither. I think that was on the trialogue now. That was a discussion, and to kind of read that, maybe you have to be in that room. But for sure, after the election next year, I believe the next parliament will work on how to kind of do this revision. But it's on the table, and the will from the member states are there. And then how this opt-out will look, I think that's to the next trialogue to figure out, or the next revision. That's how I read it, but for sure, it's the people who was in that room who maybe know exactly how they were thinking.
Okay, thank you. Svante is standing on his toes. He wants to come in.
I could talk for hours about the new ETS system, but I won't do that. You already heard me for 30 minutes. I keep this brief. I've been doing research on climate policies since 2001 or something horrible like that, and seen policies come and go. Most of it is actually impressively good. If we look at Sweden, almost all CO2 emissions have a price tag. And we know that that is the best way, the most efficient way to decrease the emissions. And we should be very, very proud of that. I think it was 1991 when we introduced the CO2 tax, right?
That was on the committee.
Excellent. And the emissions are going down. As you say, we basically have no individual fossil-based heating anymore in Sweden. Should be proud about that. Looking at the EU, I'm impressed. I mean, we had the pandemics, we got a war in Ukraine, we got inflation, which is just bizarre, and we still manage to push Fit for 55 through, which is and it's extremely strengthening the emissions will be reduced extremely compared to before Fit for 55. So Sweden, a lot of good policies, some less good. EU, impressive. What's a bit weird is that when you stand in Sweden, we seem to just ignore the EU. And that is strange.
This is what me and John spoke about ahead of this seminar, that we have a quite special situation here, where Sweden is a front runner in many ways, doing good, as both of you pointed out, and many people have been involved in that work. And now we also have, we are picking the cherries from that work, and the industry is really well going, and many companies in this country is front runners in different areas. Then we have a legislation that is ambitious on the EU level, but there is some kind of gap when we speak about it now. So in the public debate in Sweden, we speak about what's done in Sweden and the Swedish climate law, but we don't speak about how it's fitting with the EU Fit for 55 and the whole climate package there and the climate law on the EU level. And I think the problem, there are many problems, because we need to also implement that and kind of make it as a puzzle function together, focus on the right areas, and don't get stuck in all debates, but actually focus on how we do for innovation, education, the skills among the labor force, make sure that the businesses have the right kind of setting for doing the work together. I think that's where the climate debate should be in Sweden now, but we still talk about targets and what we have done a while ago. And I also find it a democratic problem that people believe that they can change things that is not up for revision now. And probably when it's up for revision, people will not be aware that now it's the time to do it, because it will be times again to be involved. So I think we need to kind of match the debate with the revisions. That's a bit what the focus should be.
I think I'd like to come back to something which I brought up in response to your presentation earlier on, and that is the enormous amount of electricity that will be used in the transformation, which is not discussed much in this volume, except for in the contribution from Finland, which brings up the issue of whether it is enough with electricity-only markets or whether it should be supplemented by some kind of capacity mechanisms. And you could also bring up different types of demand-side management tools in order to make it possible to rely so heavily on intermittent electricity production from wind in particular. And I think this is very essential in the sense that if we miss a little bit of our time schedule, and we don't really know what the lead times will be, because this involves also the entire distribution network in our country and in neighboring countries, we will run into difficulties. Electricity, fossil-free electricity, is an enormous resource, potentially much larger than biofuels or bioenergy. So it's very important that we can rely on having access to this electricity when we need it. And that is not much discussed in the volume. So if I would like to give you some idea for future work in the Nordic context, it might be to look more closely on the electricity markets.
Jutta?
I absolutely see that, and I hopefully the government see it too. That this is a big part of what needs to be done, and to be able to have the infrastructure is one part of it, and make sure that we do that. That it's, as I understand, Norway is really ahead here and doing a lot, but we need to have it whole of Sweden too, and make sure that people can rely on it. But I do see, and I understood in the first panel that you spoke about the biofuels and the blending and the discussion there. But I do think that we need to see, as been pointed out in the Swedish radio today, that there are many old cars also still on the streets, and they also need to be part of this. And it will be more difficult if that old fleet is not also transformed in some way. So I would like to hear a little bit on that part, why in the first panel you had a lot of discussions on this, but for me electrification is the big kind of the lion part. If you look at the 2050 for Europe or for EU, and also our own target in Sweden. That's the lion part, but we also need to do something about the old fleet.
We start with electrification, of course, is needed for other stuff than just transport. But it will probably play a major role there. The idea we had, I think, was that the biofuels should be used to sort of bridge that gap until more or less the entire fleet will be electric by 2040-ish, 2035 or something like that. I don't know, but you definitely have a point. I mean, we could go for 100% electrification in the new fleet, but we still won't reach -70 because we have old cars, and if they emit a lot of fossil CO2, well, we have to do something else.
And Denmark, for example, don't need to do that because they can phase out natural gas in heating. Is that the case? Yeah.
But we could trade if we adjust.
Per, and then
I think that we eventually will need some kind of a scrapping scheme, but not necessarily in the near time. And I think it will become even more evident that it's needed when it comes to motorized machinery or mobile machinery. Agriculture tractors, for instance, they tend to become pretty old. And so we need to replace also in that sector. But my concern with electricity is not primarily with providing enough electricity for the road transport sector. It's the industrial transformation which will require even more. And I think it was interesting to take part in Mikael Huel's part of the report, which you also touched upon, carbon capture and storage, and how a market for carbon capture and storage, in what time frame could that develop? Because I think we need to move on simultaneously on different routes, because the time is so short.
I do think, and I think on the EU level, one has good hopes for bio-CCS, bio-CCU as being complementary and important, but we do need to reduce emissions in a big scale also, and make sure that is happening without having very unequal societies and lots of social tensions. So I think, and I think also the message from the EU Commission is that one needs many different political tools. It cannot be all the eggs in one basket. Yes, electrification is a very big part of it, but still one needs to also help different sectors with also other tools. And when I think about the private cars, one talks about that they live for 17 years and people still buy them, and they are even though the Swedish companies see that electrification is it, and they will completely change to that, there will be many years where we still people buy the gasoline cars or diesel cars even. And therefore, I think it's important that there is a system to help out there. So I'm a bit worried about the new proposal from the government here. But yet, if there are other good ideas on how to do it, how to help the transport and especially the cars to emit less, I would be very eager to listen to it. But I think we need some more tools. And I think in the climate debate it's always like this. All people likes to find one tool, the magic trick that would be so helpful for everything. I don't think it's like that. I think it's like when you work with building a society, you need to have different measures. There is not one magic tool. If you like to create a society that's safe, equal for people, or equal opportunities, if that's your goal, like in my party, that's very big, the master plan, it's not easy. You cannot do it by only having good school system or only good buildings and homes for people. You cannot do it with only having the tool of having a labor market that's fair for everyone and good salaries. You need all of it. That's the trick. And I think in climate, we need to be more like that. We cannot see that it's only that sector, it's only that tool, it's about chasing the emissions everywhere. And then during the way, we will do some mistakes. We will do some things that's a little bit too expensive, little bit less efficient than we thought, but together we are building this new, more sustainable system and society.